into juvenile justice system for status offenses, but a loophole, the valid court order exception, allows that to happen in a bootstrapping context. As long as the status offense is also a violation of a valid court order, like ordering a girl to go to school, if that girl is truant, she goes to jail. Status offenses are determined only by age: truancy, drinking, running away. And what do truancy, drinking, and run away typically signify? It's trauma. These are kids' attempt to escape an abusive home or missing school because their trafficker demands that they do. So that link with trauma is why girls suffer arguably the most from the VCO loophole. It's not a coincidence that girls' rates of arrest and detention for status offenses are disproportionately high, higher than boys. A phase-out has been suggested, I know, and we would certainly support the ending of this practice. States can do it themselves. I think it's 23 states don't make use of the VCO exception, and more states should take their own action to do so.
I would also recommend when we do see these girls in these vulnerable situations to find out what's happening at the home, find out what's happening in their life that's causing them to either run away or act out or just even be involved in. There's other instances as far as where once they're in their lifestyle, these girls are terrified. They may want to leave, but they don't know how to leave. Their families have been threatened, their lives have been threatened, and so they'll continue in that lifestyle for the sake of saving their lives and their families. And so it's easy to say that, okay, we won't put them in jail, which that has to happen, but what solutions are you offering them instead of allowing them to stay out in the streets? We have to create exit plans, safe exit plans for them to safely get away from their pimps, safely get away from their lifestyle in a way that to where their lives aren't impacted or their families' lives aren't impacted. I even thought of maybe, I went down the street one day and saw this girl who clearly did not want to be there, and I simply handed her a Taco Bell Taco Bell card that says call me for a special taco order or something, letting her know that if you need someone to talk to, if your pimp found this, he wouldn't think anything of it. He would think it's just a solicitation for tacos or something. But we need to find ways where we can safely get them out, because we can lock the doors and say, okay, they can't come to jail, but what other alternatives are presented to them?
Well, and I would also say that we, just from a juvenile justice side, along with what you were saying, is we have to show up. A lot of what we've done in the past is we've failed these kids because we didn't show up, and we judged them and everything that we talked about. And I think when we get better with reaching out to our community-based organizations and services, and they know that when they're in that place and they need to make that phone call at 2 o'clock in the morning, someone's going to answer that phone and somebody's going to show up. Because when we haven't done that in the past, I think they've realized that, and I think that the traffickers and exploiters will put that in their head, that they don't care about you, because when you run away from placement, they're not going to come look for you. And we don't, oftentimes. And when you need help at 2 o'clock in the morning, they're not going to answer the phone. And so we need to wrap those services around. So we, bottom line, just show up. So kids feel like I can leave this and I can trust you, where we haven't been able to trust us in the past. And when we're there to support them, whatever it takes. And it takes all of us together, not just a system. It really takes more about advocates and community-based services. That's what the system really relies on, is to make sure that those supports are in place and happen for those kids, so we can work this as a team.
And I just want to quickly plug the JJDPA, which both Michelle and Rebecca mentioned. The JJDPA is the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act. It's the seminal piece of federal legislation governing youth in state facilities and state juvenile justice systems across the country. And this is a critical bill. It was last reauthorized in 2002. And so it's more than due for a reauthorization. We have a strong bipartisan bill that went through the Senate Judiciary Committee this summer. And so we're hoping to use this report and this briefing to really build momentum and support around a bipartisan House JJDPA to address many of these issues that our panelists have raised. As Michelle pointed out, OJJDP funding, Title II funding in JJDPAs, where they were able to provide funding for innovative programs like the STAR Court and their trafficking response protocol. And so really critical to reauthorize this legislation and to address some of these, striking issues. The Senate bill, for instance, addresses the use of restraints, like Mia referred to. It eliminates the use of restraints on pregnant girls behind bars. It requires collection of data of pregnant girls behind bars and screens for trafficking and commercial sexual exploitation so that we can identify those children in the juvenile justice system and route them into appropriate community-based services and interventions. So it really is an opportunity in the context of all these larger conversations we're having on the Hill on criminal justice reform to ultimately include juvenile justice reform in that and really highlight the experiences of our girls.
I would also just recognize that we should open the conversation to more systems than just juvenile justice. Michelle's just given us an amazing example of what can happen when a juvenile justice system becomes trauma sensitive and gender responsive. We also need to recognize the roles, for example, of schools. And when girls experience trauma, whether it's on campus or off campus, it can lead to behavior in school that can be treated punitively, and many girls are in juvenile justice because their schools put them there. So we need to really take the 30,000-foot view and see who's interacting with girls in their lives. We need to train also school resource officers and administrators. It's not just the juvenile justice system itself. We need to act preventatively to meet girls where they live, in their communities and in their schools, to make sure that the response to them can recognize the trauma that can be the root of their behavior, and also recognize the intersectionality of girls who live at the intersection of both race and gender, because when implicit bias enters into the equation as well, when administrators react to girls, that can further complicate the reaction to those girls and funnel them into the juvenile justice system. Black girls are 17% of all female students, but they're 43% of the girls who are arrested. They're 6 times more likely to be suspended than white girls.
Sure, and we have time for some questions, please.
You spoke to a vulnerability that you experienced once you were placed. Were you speaking to the authorities who used you and manipulated you, and were you talking about other similarly situated?
More so the sexual exploitation occurs in placement. But then in the group home setting, placement is like a lockdown placement type.
Was it at hand because of what people in authorities allowed to happen?
People in authority, meaning the people that watched me every day and made sure that I was being compliant while in the group home. Yes.
Then, I just have 2 questions. Is Hayes School a residential school?
No, it's not residential.
So where did you go every day?
That's when I got in trouble, so I didn't want to go home. But they don't, there's no beds at Pace.
Right.
If Pace isn't the appropriate setting for a girl, they usually recommend something residential, but then they come back to Pace. But at that time, I was still at home.
And does the definition of prostitution have any limitations on age? Like, can you
So that's actually,
be charged with prostitution as a minor?
yes, so
Yeah.
that's actually a huge problem
Yeah.
because
We should
the
put
prostitution
that in.
charge, so that's actually, a huge part of our anti-trafficking advocacy. In most states, these kids aren't even old enough to be consenting to sexual activity, yet they're being charged and detained and incarcerated for prostitution offenses. And that's true despite the fact that we have federal anti-trafficking laws that make clear that any minor under the age of 18 engaged in a commercial sex act, whether it be forced prostitution, whether it be pornography, whether it be stripping, all of those are commercial sex acts, and any minor under the age of 18 who is engaged in those activities is considered by definition a victim of trafficking. So we do have this inconsistency between the federal law and the state laws in terms of trafficking and also in terms of consent.
Thank you.
A couple of people should have been acknowledged right at the beginning. Malika Sadasar, please stand up. Executive Director of the Human Rights Project for Girls. I'm personally very happy because she's taking her leadership to Los Angeles, and so hopefully we'll make some additional changes there. I want to acknowledge my colleague from Atlanta, Georgia, Hank Johnson, who Hank has been on the forefront of criminal justice reform in many different ways, but most notably recently, really addressing the issue of police abuse. And in particular, all of the publicity that has happened around shootings and all. For those of us that are old enough to remember life before a video camera, we know that these incidences have always gone on. The only difference now is a cell phone camera. But he is attempting to address that legislatively. And I'd like to ask him to say a few words. And then afterwards, I have some couple of questions I wanted to ask.
Thank you all for being here and looking around the room. Males are the predators here that we're talking about largely, not exclusively male, but basically this is a problem that males participate in and instigate. And so it's good to see the males who are here. Quite frankly, the fact that we don't have more males here is a symptom of the problem that you all are dealing with. And so I'm glad to be here to show my solidarity and sensitivity to this issue. And I'm under the leadership of Karen Bass, who's a great leader here in Congress. And we need more people. We need more women like Karen Bass to be here as congresspeople and as staffers. And so I just want to encourage you all, to everyone that's here, to let's not forget about our girls, our women. Let's take personal responsibility for making sure that they can grow up unmolested and able to be whole psychologically and happy and prosperous and contributing to the greatness of our nation. So thank y'all so much.
So I wanted to ask a couple of questions, but I also want to begin by thanking you for what you do. For the work that every single one of you do is just so critical. And then to our three young women, I just want to say I'm sorry. I'm sorry that we failed you, because that's the bottom line. I mean, that's what happened. And I really appreciate deeply your willingness to share your stories. And I want you to know that it's not just a matter of listening to you. We sit here, and I'm watching my friend right there, Bonnie. Her brain's working, because we're trying to take these stories and turn them into policy and address so that other women are not failed, other girls aren't failed. So I wanted to ask a couple of questions. One, I wanted to know if you could define, Michelle, what the safe harbor. You said that we're not a safe harbor state. And so what does that mean? Because even though I'm here, I still have a foot in Sacramento with my friends that are there, and maybe we need to change state law. And then, the real dilemma, and I don't in any way think that girls should be incarcerated at all, but we have the dilemma of not really having places, like you said, So when you were describing the camps, I just wonder if there's any way that some facilities in LA, there is this one facility we were looking at, McLaren Hall, that was used years ago as an emergency shelter, but it wound up not being for emergencies, it wound up being long-term. So is there a way to convert some of these facilities so that they are not jails, but they're actually shelters? And I remember, Kaisha, when we first met, I think you were in Utah. Were you in Utah? No?
Iowa.
Oh, you were in Iowa, okay. I knew it was someplace different. Excuse me. But anyway, it was far away from Compton. And so how do we, address that? So can some facilities be changed into shelters?
Yes. So Yasmin might be the best person to ask to really talk about safe harbor. I just know that we are still a state that arrests children. I think in safe harbor states that they have law, their state law prohibits the arrest of children.
So safe harbor laws actually vary from state to state. There are some states that provide immunity to a prostitution charge. There are some states that provide an arrest but a mandatory referral to services, so it's more of a diversion process. As part of the Justice for Victims of Trafficking Act, we did have a provision in there that would incentivize states to adopt safe harbor legislation and to really discourage the prosecution of minors, all under the age of 18, for prostitution and related offenses. And so that is a growing trend we're seeing among the states, but as you pointed out, safe harbor has to be paired with funding for services and placements, because if we're not arresting these kids, we have no way of bringing them in for services and interventions. And so arrest is absolutely unacceptable for this population, but we have to provide the funding and the services and leverage existing resources in our community, as Michelle said, to be able to provide comprehensive wraparound services so that our kids aren't being serviced by the detention system and the justice system.
So I want to take the opportunity to introduce my colleague, Bobby Scott from Virginia, who is one of the leaders in both houses on criminal justice reform and has been fighting for the Youth Promise Act for a number of years. But now that we have this little opening, I know Mr. Scott is trying to run through it as fast as possible to see how far we can push the envelope on criminal justice reform.
Thank you. Please join Hank and Bonnie for working on girls and the problems that girls have with sexual abuse and the sexual abuse to prison pipeline, and Barbara Lee, but mostly for Karen Bass for all that you've done with girls, particularly those in foster care, which is an area that we usually overlook. I'm sorry I'm running late, but we're at a hearing on Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act, where we pointed out where we were pointing out that the juvenile delinquency rate for boys is just about stable, but it's going off the chart with girls. And foster care, sexual trauma have been two of the leading causes of that increase. We've had a lot of testimony in the hearing on trauma-informed treatment, where you consider the trauma that people have gone through as part of the treatment process, and if you ignore that, you're really not doing much. And family therapy, treating the individual, one witness said it was almost useless. If you're not treating the family, you're not really getting the job done. And so there's a lot we can do, and we just have to make sure we do it. You mentioned the Youth Promise Act, which now that I'm ranking member on the Education and Workforce Committee, we're going to try to get the Youth Promise Act in the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, or Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act, or Safe Justice Act, or child nutrition, anything. So I think we're looking good, and a prevention and early intervention approach. One witness from Right on Crime talked about investments in crime reduction that not only reduce crime but also save a lot of money, and that's given us a lot of support across the political spectrum. So Karen, thank you very much for what you're doing. I'm sorry I was running late, but I'm going to get the witness testimony so I'll know exactly what was said. You're doing great, and we can solve this problem. Thank you.
So I tell you, we do have the warriors of Congress here, and one of the most notable is Congresswoman Barbara Lee. Please stand up. On numerous issues, both domestic and international, and you should know that the president just recently appointed her to be the representative from the House of Representatives to the United Nations.
Thank you all, first of all, for being here, for sharing your stories, and for really opening up this space for us here on Capitol Hill to continue to beat the drum. And I just have to say to Congresswoman Bass, she's taken on so many issues that have never been touched before on this Hill. And so I just want to thank you, Karen, for really violent child and sexual abuse is one of the primary predictors of a girl's entry into the juvenile justice system. That is a shame and disgrace. In my home state of California, 80% of girls in the juvenile justice system had been abused, had been beaten, they had been raped. And so this is something that we all have to come to grips with, because our young women's futures are being ripped away before they even start. They're forced to go directly into, from an abusive environment into an abusive environment, which is the criminal justice system. Simply unacceptable. I'm a psychiatric social worker, my fellow social worker by profession. I have my MSW, clinical psychiatric social work was my major. And let me tell you, the mental health and trauma-related care in our communities is lacking in our juvenile facilities, in our hospitals, in our community clinics. And so we need to have more professional support, not only in our communities, but in our schools. And so all of us have legislation. I have one bill, HR 2375, which would provide grants to states to hire more mental health professionals in our school system. You know, our young girls deserve that. We've got to increase funding for mental health services. That's such a big part of the solution of what we're here to talk about today. So I just want to thank you all very much. Congresswoman Bonnie Watson-Coleman, Bobby Scott, Hank Johnson. These are the real troopers who've been on this for so long in terms of cracking that cradle to prison pipeline. And so finally, Congresswoman Bass, you put our young girls in the center of that cracking that pipeline. So thank you again very much. Look forward to your testimony. Thanks for being so bold.
So do we have time for a couple more questions from the audience? Yes?
So, how difficult is it to bring these individuals back to the labor market?
So the question was, how difficult is it for individuals who have survived the sexual abuse to prison pipeline or the justice system to reintegrate back into society, both in terms of gaining job opportunities, correct?
I'll answer that from this perspective. So one of the major implications of this type of abuse is that it doesn't end the second you turn 18. So when you turn 18, it's not, once you continue to commit the act, you are now criminalized even further, and you have this on your record. And while most jobs cannot deny you employment from having prostitution on your record, because it's not on my record, but I know a lot of people whose record it is on, they look at you differently, and they don't want to hire you if you have prostitution on your records. They don't trust you. They think you're going to steal from them, or you're going to do anything to get money, because that's why essentially you're a prostitute. That's the way they think. And even when it comes to going to college, you live in this constant fear of, okay, well, people I'm in school with find out about this. Even if I do get a job, you have to worry about, okay, what if someone sees what I did, or someone finds out what I did? Will I lose my job? So you live in a constant state of fear of people finding out and people knowing. And so it's hard to really, even though jobs may become available, you may be able to go to college. I've heard of people getting kicked out of colleges from people finding out about them being sexually exploited through like pornography. So if someone finds out about your video, it gets passed around. I've heard of a school actually kicking a girl out because they didn't want that type of, they don't want people to look at their school as if they accepted people who did that. And so there's so many further implications even once you're able to obtain employment or go to college. And that's why I kind of took this route to just say, to advocate and say, I don't care what anybody thinks, because I have huge plans for myself. And I know that the only way that I'm going to achieve those plans is just to be confident and to go out and say, hey, let me tell you what happened first, and then you can't throw it in my face later. This is who I am. This is what I did. This is what I'm working towards. This is who I am now. And then you get to make the decision on if you want, to accept me or not. Because once you accept yourself, then it's a whole different ballgame. And so we need to make sure that we're helping girls to regain confidence, to love themselves. And only at that point will they be able to go into society and into life and, confidently look for employment and confidently, seek an education, because they don't feel that they're worthy of either.
And just beyond prostitution, juvenile arrests even and juvenile adjudications do follow many young people and can inhibit their opportunities in terms of accessing education and job opportunities. So just moving beyond prostitution, those records do follow our kids.
We also need to do a better job getting education to people who are in the juvenile justice system. We need to do a better job getting credits transferred to people who are there so that that can lead to workforce development and workforce opportunities upon release as well.
I think we have one more question over here.
Russell Armstrong, representing the Committee for Children. We talked a lot, including Congressman Lee spoke up about the prevalence of child sex abuse and how it leads to folks either getting into trafficking or entering into the juvenile justice system. My concern is that there's been a lot of focus on how do we reduce some of the symptoms of this system, but why is there any recommendations that you all have in terms of ways to reduce the root causes and to actually drive funding? Because without funding, all the efforts don't necessarily count. So how can we drive more funding to the prevention of child sexual abuse and not just child abuse and neglect overall?
I mean, we have to make noise. We have to make sure that this is an issue people are talking about, because that's when funding comes. If we sit back and say, oh, it's just a girls thing and it's a smaller population, then people aren't going to fund it. And they're not even going to pay attention to the root cause. So we need to make noise. We need to make sure we're getting whoever's faces we need to get in front of to make sure that they're addressing it. And that's why I'm just very, just proud of what Karen Bass is doing, because she's doing that. She's putting us at the forefront of this issue. Whenever there's a issue that's brought up, it's always focused on men. It's always focused on boys. And there may be a and girl component, but we're never the focus. And so we need to make sure that we are the focus, and we need to make sure more advocacy groups are coming together. We need to pay attention to the community-based organizations that are there trying to do this very thing and aren't getting attention. And like you said, without funding, we can talk as much as we want, but nothing's going to happen, because money takes money to do everything. It takes money to get these resources to provide for these girls. So that is the question of the day. Thank you for asking it.
And we have time for one more question.
Okay, sorry that mine's the last. So my concern, and I think Congresswoman Bass and the panelists touched on it a little bit, but when you talk about, changing law enforcement procedures so that there's no arrest and incarceration after, you come across the girl who's been prostituted, my concern is that, she remains under the control of her pimp, because if the cop has no recourse and no grounds to hold the girl, there's no separation. And I like the idea of the taco card, but we know there's a lot of brainwash that happens. And so I guess I wonder if there's any proposal to have maybe a mandatory 30-day retention, not detention, but saying when a cop comes across this, especially, the girl's under age 18, we're gonna, separate her. We have grounds to separate her and have her in custody. So is there a proposal for that, I guess, my question.
Go ahead, Kaisha.
Okay. From my personal experience, like being detained and stuff, I feel that there shouldn't be no need to be detained. There should be different services, like a house that we can go to that's gonna give us services to stay away from our pimps, even though it was hard for me to stay away because I thought this person loved me because I didn't receive it at home. But I still had mentors and advocates coming out, making sure I was on the right path, doing what I was supposed to do, and having wraparound services and stuff, and different homes that girls can go to get the right services and care.
And also this thing of detention, because we struggle with this a lot, because I think there's a lot of perception out there that the only way to really protect these kids from going back is to lock them up. And there's two thoughts of that for me. What we see is, because it's interesting because we on the operations side through juvenile justice are trying to get kids out of detention. So law enforcement will bring them in and we hurry to get them out. So detention is 48 hours, detention is 14 days, and for these kids, safety is much longer than 14 days. And so really, to me, it doesn't make any sense. I mean, you can keep a kid safe for 24 hours, and then what? And I think we really struggle with that. I think the thing that we've, and I speak a lot about this too, because again, working with juvenile justice for a long time, in fact, just in the past 3 months, I've had a young woman that AWOL'd from foster care that had a very significant substance abuse problem that went out and overdosed on drugs and died. And to me, we have a lot of kids that run from care. kids that are being sexually exploited run from care too. And I think it really has to do with services and support and outreach and showing up, and relationships, which makes a bigger difference. So kids begin to trust instead of distrust. And once we can do that, because a lot of kids run from care for a lot of different reasons. And to me, I kind of facetiously say, if we really want to care about kids' safety, especially kids in care, we should lock them all up. All of them, CSEC or not, just all kids up, because they run back. They're kids. Their lives are very complicated because of being taken away at a very young age for no fault of their own. And I know that that's something we really struggle with. With our first responder protocol, one of the things that I think we've done a really good job at is once a law enforcement officer identifies a young person, they call out to the child abuse hotline. We dispatch a unit to them within 90 minutes, wherever they're at, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So law enforcement has an alternative to detention where we come and they give them to us, and we have an advocate also meet us there, and sometimes a survivor advocate. So we wrap that young person around with services within 90 minutes of coming off the street. And then we stay with them for the first 72 hours, up to the first 72 hours, wherever they're at. And we've had some of our kids say, I wanted to run, but the advocate was still there, and she bought pizza, and so I felt like I got to stay. So within that first 72 hours, we've had 2 kids AWOL. And we've had about 40 kids so far that we've come in contact with, which we think is pretty remarkable because usually they're in and out. We drop them off, we walk out, they walk out right behind us. And even in that 72 hours, they're building relationships and making connections. So it might be that 5th day that they run back, but within 2 or 3 days, they're contacting the advocate or the survivor saying, hey, can you come get me? Because they've already had a little bit of a connection. And then when we show up and we start to do that a lot more than just, it's another case, we'll just leave it alone and go on to the next case, I think it's starting to make a little bit of a difference step by step. But I think it's still a lot of work we have to do because I think, we would all feel better at night if we could keep these kids in custody or keep them away from them. I just don't know that that's the answer because kids, again, still feel like they're being punished. If you're calling me a victim and you're locking me up, I think it's a bad message to them too, and it's harder for us to really engage on the back end. So it's kind of a quandary.
I want to touch on this because you raise a great question of them being brainwashed, and something we need to understand is that a lot of these girls, if not all of them, come from very tough environments. And so when they get in a situation where they feel, even if it's lying or not, they feel that someone loves them and is taking care of them and that what they're doing is in the best interest of themselves. So you have the fear component, but you also have the component of them really thinking that this person loves me and is going to take care of me and this is where I need to be and there's nothing else out there for me. And the whole reason why I didn't give up such a big fight at the time, even though I was locked, in placement when it happened, was because I asked myself, well, what do I have to lose? I mean, my mom doesn't want me. I don't know where my dad is. The system treats me like crap. I have nothing. So what if people find out? So what if people know? I had nothing to look forward to, nothing to aspire to be. So we're going to hold on to the only thing we think we have. So that's a great question. As we are looking to provide services, we have to find a way to give them hope, bring them people like, that people that experienced what they experienced and came out of it successfully. They need to see that, because if they don't see that, there's no hope for them. Through the grace of God, I was able to get out. I got pregnant right away and made the decision to either abort this child to prevent him from having to experience what I experienced, or just stepping out on faith and making something of myself. But everyone doesn't think like that. I had the mentality that, after being degraded so much and being told that I was worthless and would never amount to anything, I had something to prove. And I wanted to prove to everybody that, no, let me show you differently. Let me fight my way through this. But goddamn it wasn't easy. It's not easy to this day. I'm 29 years old with a master's degree and the director of a #1 healthcare organization in the world, and it's still not easy because I still have to fight as an African American to hold on to what I built. And I want to run for office one day, and I know that that's going to be thrown in my face. I know that there's going to be some evil bastard out there that wants to say, well, look at what she did. So that's why I'm standing here today letting you know what I did, letting you know in whatever book I come out with that it happened. So that could be one thing that I refuse to let anybody use against me. So we have to give these girls hope. They have to see that this is possible, that I can go from zero to hero. I can go from disgrace to honor. They need to see that because they are brainwashed. So let's recultivate their minds. Let's be the person that unwashes that filth and negativity from their mind and give them hope. It is now. Yes. Yes.
So, do you have one more
Hi.
question?
The last question. I really appreciate seeing women and women leaders coming here to speak about juvenile justice reform and how we can make things better, or how can we make things better. But when we turn on the news, we see that this movement is mainly focused on men. We don't hear about the girls and their stories in the mainstream media. So how do you propose we change that discourse?
I didn't hear the beginning of the question. I was still crying.
The question was basically that in all of these conversations, there's still such a huge emphasis on men and boys, and how do we change that discourse? How do we demand to change that conversation?
I mean, we have, did anyone want to touch on that? Go ahead. I think it's important to understand where these boys come from, who's breeding all of these boys that are in our systems. We have to understand that the root starts with the parent, the mother, and if the woman isn't getting the attention she needs, she's going to continue to breed all of these men that we're focusing on. So maybe if we just kind of redirected the framework of how it's being addressed would help, but that's...
Yeah. And I also think we need to lift girls up, and we need to bring young women and girls' voices to the table, and they've just got to be heard, and we all need to listen and put them, and bring and lift them up to really take this on.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's one of the reasons that we're convening this briefing today, one of the reasons that our organizations launch the report. I mean, I think that's just something that we have to demand. These issues that are affecting our young women and girls demand our attention and demand our collective action. And we just have to be those voices in the room that are consistently arguing, what about the girls? What about the young women, and particularly our young women of color? I think in all of these conversations, again, around criminal justice reform, juvenile justice reform, mass incarceration, these issues affect our girls too. And so I think it's critical that we have those conversations and we build those relationships with, male allies, those who are fostering a healthy masculinity, a masculinity that doesn't denigrate or advance violence against young women and girls. But that's exactly what we're hoping to do here today, and to continue to build bipartisan support for this issue. As we've seen, we had a number of lawmakers stop by, take time out of their day to come here, and I think that really highlights what an important issue this is, and it's an issue that matters to both sides of the aisle. We've seen that it matters in both chambers of Congress, and so to continue to elevate the voices of our powerful survivor advocates and to elevate these programs and best practices all across the country that we know are making a real difference and have instituted the cultural changes that we know work. And so I think that that's the greatest takeaway from today. I want to thank all of you for taking the time to be here with us. Thank you for those watching on the live stream. And I want to thank our panelists. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today, and particularly our young women here. It takes unbelievable courage and strength to be able to share your experiences and your story here in the halls of Congress, and we're grateful for you doing that. So thank you all so much, and thank you for Congresswoman Bass. Thank you to your staff.